Hello crafty friends, I'm Lien from Studio Kato and I'm so glad you're joining me again today. Today I'll be making a 2-for-1 design. What that means is that you'll have one background done and you'll be left over with one element to use on another card. I think this works best with large images, so I'm using the large butterfly from the Butterflies stamp set by Pinkfresh Studio. And I'm stamping that once with Versafine Onyx black ink onto Canson Montval 200 GSM watercolor cardstock. I'm using watercolor cardstock because I wanted to experiment, but you absolutely don't have to use it. You can use whatever thick cardstock you have on hand. So I'm stamping that in Versafine Onyx black, and I have prepped my cardstock beforehand with an anti-static powder tool because I will do some embossing later. I'm using my Misti because, as Laura Fedora says, you stamp it twice to make it nice. I'm covering that with Wow Clear Gloss Superfine Embossing Powder. And then I'm using that same ink and same embossing powder to stamp a butterfly on another piece of cardstock. This one is Clairefontaine DCP 250 GSM cardstock, and I trimmed it down to be A2 size. I'm using the butterfly that I stamped on watercolor cardstock as a mask, so I trimmed it out and I will be using double folded purple tape to adhere it down onto my other panel. You can use any temporary adhesive for this. I know this cardstock is sturdy enough to use some inky techniques on it, and if I choose to ink blend on it, none of the corners will pull up, even though they're not perfectly adhered down. If you use a nice cardstock like this to mask off your element instead of using regular masking paper, you can use that element as a focal point or focal image on another card. It will already be colored nicely by any inky techniques that you choose to use for your background now. You can do some ink blending here, but I chose to go directly to paper with my ink cubes because I want to get that mixed media look. I'm not really doing any mixed media techniques here. I'm not using mixed media. I'm just using my inks. I will do some stenciling later, but by just using my inks directly to paper, stamping them down instead of blending them out nicely, the background will already have some interesting texture to it. I'm going to make a rainbow background here, but for each color I used, so here I'm using yellow, I'm using 3 different shades of yellow. Keep in mind that these inks, because you're applying them directly to paper, will appear way darker. So maybe choose one shade lighter than you really want. You can always add more inks on top if you do find it too light in the end. To get a nice rainbow ombre effect, I am overlapping the colors quite a bit. I'm using the Pinkfresh Studio inks here. I really like the colors they come in, and the ink cubes actually come in 4 shades for each color group, which makes it really easy to choose my colors for this rainbow effect. You can absolutely use any inks you have. I think this would be great with oxide inks. They don't come in ink cubes, but that's not really an issue. If you don't have ink cubes, or you want to use your oxide inks for this, you can use a solid stamp and just stamp that out randomly. However, I wouldn't use my Misti for that because, one, it would take ages to always move it around, and also you're just tempted when you use your Misti to make a perfectly stamped impression. I think it's really nice that with the ink cubes, you don't get a perfectly stamped square. And that absolutely adds to the texture in this background. Something else you could do if you don't have ink cubes and you don't have a small solid stamp, you could use your ink blending foams. I know we all switched to the blending brushes ages ago, and now they have all these domed foams. But I bet you still have those original blending foams from Ranger from way back in the day. just lying around and not using them anymore. If you ink those up and stamp with them, that would be nice as well. You'll have circles instead of squares, but it would still work. And if you just want to do an entirely different technique, different inky technique, you could use just ink blending like I've mentioned before, or you could use some sprays. I don't have any, but that would be really cool to use with this, and it would go a lot faster probably. Though this background didn't take me a long time. I think it took me 10 minutes to make, and that was totally worth it because I got 2 cards out of it. Now, because the cardstock I cut the mask out of is so thick, I can't really get the color to stamp down right up to the edge of it, so I'm blending up some extra color right up to the edge. I'm not paying close attention to how I'm coloring the mask. As I mentioned at the start of this video, I wanted to do some experimenting. I wanted to add some water to this butterfly, that's why I cut it out of watercolor cardstock. And I wanted to see how it would react to that. If you don't want to do that, just cover the entire mask like you're doing the background. I'm going to add some stenciling with white pigment ink. I'm adding that ink to my blending mat so I can pick up the color with a blending brush, and if I reactivate some of the colorful ink and go back with my blending brush, I won't ruin my white ink pad. This is the Seamless Blooms set, stencil set by Pinkfresh Studio, and I'm only using the flower layers on this. Now for my little experiment, I am spraying my inked butterfly with water. The Pinkfresh Studio inks are dye inks, so they are water reactive. So I'm just dabbing some of that color up with a cloth. And I'm just playing around with that until I'm happy with the result. Then I set it aside to dry so I can finish the first card. I'm using a rectangle die here, but I'm not die cutting anything. I am just using this to trace around it with a black fine liner so I can have an easy frame. I love using just black fine liner to make a simple frame on my card and ground an image. The die just makes sure I don't have to measure anything out at all. I'm not tracing over my butterfly. I want that butterfly to... I taped it in place with purple masking tape, so I don't have to worry about it shifting around. But I will move that masking tape around, so I can also trace around the inside of the die. I'm not adding a solid line on the inside, I'm just adding a dash line. This will again give a different texture to the background and to the card. This will also widen the frame, and that will correspond nicely with the quite large and heavy image we've used. And that will pretty much finish up the first card. I'm just going to add this to a card base. I'm not going to add a sentiment. I'm not going to add any sequins or anything like that. I think the background is busy enough as is, and I also don't want to take anything away from it. So I'm simply gluing it down onto a top folding white note card, and that's the first card all done. I really like the subtle white flowers and the frame we added. Now I'm just figuring out the layout of the second card and seeing which pieces I might add to this. I chose to add a simple sentiment strip, white embossed onto black cardstock. The sentiment is from a Pinkfresh Studio stamp set, and again all the supplies are listed in the supply list down below. To give this sentiment strip some sturdy dimension, I am layering 5 more strips of black cardstock behind it. I'm using my Barely Arts Precision Craft Glue, but any liquid glue would work just fine here. Now for clean and simple cards, I really like to subtly break up the white space, and I do that by adding a smaller panel on top of my white note card. My smaller panel is 4.5 inches by 3.25 inch, and I am layering 5 more layers of thick white cardstock behind that. These are slightly smaller than the panel I am propping up. I cut these dimensional pieces slightly smaller, just so it's easier to line everything up. If you cut them all the same size, you have to be really precise with gluing them together, and now you just glue them together, and even if you shift them around a little bit, it doesn't really matter that much. No one is going to see it. Usually when I adhere butterflies to a card, I only adhere the body down, so the wings are slightly floating above the card. I couldn't do that here because I want to add a sentiment strip on top. So to add some dimension to the wings, I am adding 2 layers of foam tape behind the wings and just glue to the body. I am going to press that body down to the paper until the glue is dry, so there is a height difference, a dimensional difference between the wings and the body of the butterfly. I'm then gluing the sentiment strip on top. This will only be adhered down to the wings. If you want, you can add a foam square in the middle to support the area above the body of the butterfly. I'm using a black fine liner to add some wonky little antennae, because I cut those off when I cut my mask. I'm finishing up the card with some sequins. These are those sequins that are totally flat and don't have a hole in them. I think they're confetti. I'm not sure what they're called. They're the Majestic Confetti by Studio Katia. I really like the subtle shine they add to the card without adding any extra color, and they're not as harsh as silver sequins or gold sequins. It takes me a little while to figure out the placement of these sequins, but when I'm happy with it, I can adhere them all down with some liquid glue. Again, I'm using the Barely Art Precision Craft Glue. And once those are all stuck down, this card is also finished. So this last one was a really quick design, a really clean and simple one. So 2 completely different cards. I finished them both in an hour. So that's a really fun 2-for-1 design. By inking up one background, I got one mixed media card, and it's 1 layer, so it's easy to mail, and one clean and simple looking card. Please leave your thoughts in the comment section below. You can find all the supplies I used in the description box, and make sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of my videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.